As you know, today is devoted to unaccompanied minors. It is a good firouche, the firouche which is linking yesterday's practitioner's presentation when Giulia Carenza from Emergency Italian program was mentioning what Emergency is doing for unaccompanied children. We know that the topic of unaccompanied children is becoming more and more serious, and more involvement is recorded on the side of NGOs and associations, volunteers, etc. But what is extremely important is that this has become an issue to be studied and also to be understood and analyzed under a juridical law profile. And it is an honor for me to welcome today Professor Susana Sanz Caballero, who has developed definitely huge expertise on this topic. She comes from Valencia, and she is based at the moment at the Cardinal Herrera University in Valencia. She has an enormous list of books and publications on international law, EU law, and recently on unaccompanied minors. She is an expert on kids' rights. She has held a Jean Monnet Chair funded by the European Commission, and now she has an expertise. She's considered as an expert and a key contact on kids' rights. As you know, we are following today the usual structure. Then we have in the morning the academic session. And then in the early afternoon we will have the PhD session. We will also have a Skype presentation because one of the participants in this crash course will not reach us. It's not a problem. We will connect with her via Skype, and then we'll end this long day with Federica Bonifacio, who's just arrived. She comes from Accoglieretes, working in Syracuse, and then this is the structure for the day, and my welcome is, as usual, very, very warm. Thanks again for being with us today. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Panebianco. I would like to start also by expressing my gratitude to the two organizers of this sensitive and topical course about managing crises at EU Med borders, both Professor Stefania Panebianco and Dr. Iole Fontana. I want to say in public what I already told them yesterday, personally. And it is that, I am very much impressed by the quality of this crash course that they have organized. And I'm not only talking about the quality maybe of the people at this side of the table, but also at the people at the other side of the table, the audience, you. Because this is not a classical course, organized for a generalistic, students, but this is a really specialized course, and I could see some lines of the CV of some of the people who are attending of you, and I was really impressed to see that there are doctoral candidates, master students working in this area, working on crisis management and EU borders. So I find that this is a luxury also for me, and this possibility to interact with you today. I have also very much appreciated, the structure of the event, its program, this mixture between this academic part and then this practitioner part, and also the possibility for PhD candidates to present their research in public. As I say, I really liked it, the design. And so I really say congratulations to the organizers. Let me also add that I am an outsider for many of you probably. I had to confess that I come from the field of law, so I feel a bit overwhelmed and among political scientists. But in my defense, I will say that I'm not a classical jurist who studies the internal order, the internal legal order of a state. Instead, I come from the field of public international law and human rights law. So I feel really comfortable normally around with political scientists around, also sociologists, also experts in international relations. So today I will be speaking about a topic I am working currently in my quality as Vice President of the International Institute of Human Rights, and it's Unaccompanied Children in Europe. And I had to say that it is something that it is in the making, okay? This work that I'm presenting today, this research is not finished, and I will very much appreciate your comments. I have been interviewing, well, the actors, also some authorities, but I am also very open to your comments and suggestions, so please help me to improve my work. Well, the final conclusion of my course today is enshrined in this phrase that you have in the screen, which is not, by the way, mine. It is a phrase by the interim director of the Agency for Fundamental Rights of the European Union, who says that we must ensure that all children receive international protection, and children are children, no matter their status. Well, asylum seekers, refugees, and people prone to subsidiary protection belong to a very well-defined vulnerable group. Migrants also are a vulnerable group, despite the fact that they do not flee their country for reasons of persecution or fear of death. They leave their country for economic reasons or because they aim for a better life. However, in recent times, the differences between these two categories of people, that of refugees and that of asylum seekers on the one hand, and that of economic migrants on the other hand, I think has begun to blur this difference. In other words, the categories of those who flee because they fear personal persecution and those who flee for a better life sometimes get mixed or confused. And why these two categories have begun to get confused? Well, I think there are several reasons. One of them, probably the most relevant of all of them, is that between these two categories of people, we have lately introduced a third category, namely that of those who run away from war, from combats, or from the advancement of terrorism. This third category of people cannot prove a personal or individualized persecution, but there is no doubt at all, I think, that their lives or their physical integrity or the lives or physical integrity of their families are also at risk if they stay at home. Moreover, there is another reason why the contours of refugees and migrants are progressively blurring. And this reason is because among the second category, that is, among what we generally call migrants, what we find more and more is people who do not flee only because of economic reasons, but we find instead massive involuntary exodus caused by very complex set of factors and variables such as human trafficking, natural disasters, man-caused disasters, hunger, drought, severe economic disparities, and also the effects of climate change. This is why nowadays we talk about forced migrations, so as to be able to include very different realities within this large group or this large concept. This very large concept of forced migrants would only leave aside and would not include the person who leaves his country without need to do it, just because he or she wants to look for new opportunities, to look for economic prosperity, to look for business chances, but without a pressing need, doing it without a pressing need, without the existence of exogenous factors that to put his life, or his or her health, or his or her dignity, or his or her survival at risk. But among all vulnerable groups, there is one group that is more vulnerable than others. These are the children who are asylum seekers, refugee children, children who are prone to subsidiary protection, and even migrant children. Unaccompanied children are more vulnerable because they're minors, because they are dependent, because they're migrants, because they're separated, and because they're isolated. And it is to this vulnerable group that I want to dedicate my words today. In the month of January, Europol touched our consciences by saying that in Europe we had lost track of 10,000 children since the beginning of the refugee crisis. We do not know where they are, who cares for them, or whether there is anyone who takes care of them. All of a sudden, the controversy erupted. Some said that the figure was even higher, and certainly I'm sure that the number of missing children will probably be higher now, 6 months later. The information that newspapers provided us about these missing children shocked us, but it was incomplete, and it left us in doubt. It is not known whether these children are in the hands of mafias, sexually abused, used for begging, subjected to slavery or prostitution. Still today, no one knows where these 10,000 children are. We do not know. It could be that some of them are with their families and their beloved ones, or with other adults who take care of them in good faith. Maybe some of them continue their way towards the north of Europe, and they're hiding because they do not want to be taken by the authorities. Sometimes it is their own family who encourage them to walk on their own a part of the route, because they know that they will receive priority attention from the authorities if they are alone. But sometimes these children fall into mafia hands, as I said. One must admit that monitoring thousands of children and not losing track of them can be complicated, because the European Union considers the detention of migrant children or the detention of children who are asylum seekers as a last resort. And in fact, I firmly believe that this practice, that of detaining children, should be banned completely. But there is a big difference between not placing children in detention and dropping them into mafia networks. Only in Germany, and only in 2015, national authorities reported 8,006 complaints of children disappearances. Most of them were teenagers between 15 and 18, but from this number, 635 were children under 14. From these 8,006 children, only 2,171 were found. Only in Germany as well, 45,000 minors were registered by national authorities as non-accompanied children in 2015. To add a terrible detail to this chronicle, I would like to remind you that a month ago, newspapers revealed that Greece had fired tear gas against children to prevent them from fleeing from a hotspot. It is not my intention to become melodramatic, but it is important to remember that we are talking about children and that we are talking also about Europe. We are talking about children who had the right to protection because of their age, and we are talking about Europe, that apparently since the end of World War II, has been an example for the rest of the world due to the way it understands and protects human beings. Let me add my opinion, and it is not a scientific opinion, it is only a personal opinion, and this opinion is that if society does not protect children, there is nothing left. If society does not protect children, there is no space for hope. Well, more and more minors enroll themselves into dangerous trips today on their own to arrive to Europe. The reasons for these risky trips are numerous, and among them we can find the war, which separates them from their parents or turns them into orphans, the advancement of jihadist terrorism, hunger, human trafficking, poverty, drought, climate change, catastrophes, both of natural or human origin, domestic violence, underdevelopment, and also the siren calls from mafias and sometimes also from local media, who make children believe that once in Europe they will get food, accommodation, social aids, job, studies, and family reunification. As I said before, we are now discovering that in quite a good number of cases, it is the family of the child or the extended community the one that saves the money to pay for the trip to the mafias. The problem is that the flow of entry in Europe has lately increased so much that it has become uncontrollable for the states of arrival, or at least that's what they say, or that's what some states say, that it has become uncontrollable for them. It can be said that the international and the European standards are not applied correctly, and many minors who arrive are not registered. Moreover, some of them, after registration, do not receive adequate protection in terms of accommodation, food, supervision, and the care and monitoring that every child deserves for his or her welfare. As I say, we do not know the exact dimensions of the phenomenon of unaccompanied children in the European Union. It is amazing but true. In the 21st century, we do not know the number of children separated from their families who roam across Europe. The exact number is unknown. Data cannot be compared because each state has a different way of acting. For example, in Greece has waived its duty to register all persons who enter Greek territory, including children. The UK only registers children seeking asylum, but it does not register the rest of them. Spain and Malta are wary of the age that incoming children declare they have, so they use very inefficient and unreliable medical procedures to determine the children's age. Indeed, it happens regularly that children of 15 or 16 years old are mistaken by adults, and as a result, they do not get the protection that they would be entitled to as children. And it is true that sometimes children also lie about their age by claiming that they are not minors in order to avoid being detained. And in the month of May, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Migrant Workers begged Greece not to detain children because it is traumatizing them. Article 18 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child established that states have the obligation to ensure the development of institutions and services responsible for the well-being of children. The law of the European Union itself establishes also minimum standards. For example, Article 30 of the Directive on the Conditions for Refugee Status and Article 19 about the Directive about Reception Conditions require that unaccompanied minors are placed with adult relatives or within foster family or in specialized centers of accommodation for minors or in another accommodation suitable for children. These minimum standards also require that the opinion of the unaccompanied minor about his preference or her preference concerning the place of residence is also taken into account. But how to do this when European countries say that they are overstretched? Children who are asylum seekers, unaccompanied migrant children, children belonging to a family, and children whose parents are asylum seekers should be treated first and foremost as children, and migration policies should give priority to their rights. But unfortunately, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child does not include specific provisions about the protection of migrant children, and the European Convention on Human Rights either. However, the Convention on the Rights of the Child stipulates that the best interests of the child shall be the primary consideration in any decision concerning children. And Article 24 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union repeats the same idea. In addition, General Comment number 6 of the Committee on the Rights of the Child of the United Nations reminds states that the enjoyment of the rights enshrined in the Convention and the application of the best interests of the child are not limited to national children, but that this protection must be available to all children, including, of course, unaccompanied children who are in their territory. So we have to ask ourselves what is the best interests of the child. But this is a very tough question. The best interest of the child, well, it refers to the full enjoyment by the child of all his or her rights and the assurance of their well-being. But the concept, it's complicated even for lawyers. This concept of the best interest of the child is an undefined legal concept. It does not have a specific meaning which is valid in all situations and in all circumstances. The child's best interest can depend on age, on sex, on maturity, on family situation, on the personal environment, on the life experiences of the child. But it is true that according to the interpretation given to the Committee of the Rights of the Child in its General Comment number 14 of 2013, this concept is a notion that one must always consider in all actions concerning children. The Stockholm program on the area of freedom, security and justice of the European Union says that children's rights must be systematically taken into account and also that an integrated approach should be the rule. However, it turns out that the Committee on the Rights of the Child recalled in 2013 that in Europe, at the moment, there is no comprehensive and effective system of protection of asylum-seeking children. The implementation of the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child is ineffective most of the cases. This is especially the case now because of the flow of people arriving from the eastern border of Europe. We apply collective solutions instead of individualized treatments for cases that involve children. And therefore, the dignity of children is not always respected. The duty to protect them is not always fulfilled. And the reception facilities are not always adapted to the needs of children. For example, in my country, in Spain, children have been detained sometimes in cells that they share with adults, with other adults that they do not know. And in Greece, once released from detention centers, unaccompanied children are ordered to leave the country, and if they do not, they face the risk of being detained again. The fact is that there is already a small but relevant set of European case law that condemns some European states because of the way they treat minors. For example, in the Popov judgment of 2012, the European Court of Human Rights ruled against France for retaining 2 children in an administrative detention center. And the same thing happened earlier in the case of Mobilancila Mayeka against Belgium in 2006, whereby a 5-year-old unaccompanied girl was detained with adult women despite her young age. The European Union declared in 2010 that it was committed to make the issue of unaccompanied children a priority because of their vulnerability and because of the risks they face. And indeed, the European Union approved the action plan on unaccompanied minors. I think it's here. No, it's not here. It will come. It approved the action plan on unaccompanied minors 2010-2014, whose three main objectives were the following. The first one was the prevention of unsafe migration and trafficking of children through improved living standards in countries of origin. The second was the establishment of reception and procedural protection which guarantee child-friendly measures. The third one was the search for long-term solutions, which include the repatriation of the child, but always restoring family links, and if this suits the best interest of the child, or the opposite, the granting of a legal status which allows the child to integrate either in the host society or in another European country or in a safe third country if that suits the best interests of the child. The European Union has made a huge effort in which it has been also assisted by the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe approved in 2007 its recommendation on life projects for unaccompanied migrants, minor migrants. The related legislative framework shows the development by the European Union of various tools dealing with the protection of children and applying to a wide range of areas. It also shows that the European Union has been strengthening these instruments in recent years. Among these legal instruments, mention can be made to the Directive on Asylum Procedures, whose Article 25 deals with children, the Directive on Reception Conditions for Persons Seeking International Protection, whose Article 11 it talks about children, the Directive on the Provision of Temporary Protection in the event of mass influx, whose Article 13 and 16 talks about children, the Dublin III Regulation, whose Article 6 and 8 deal with children, the Directive on Family Reunification, the Return Directive, the Directive on the Prevention of and Fight Against Trafficking of Persons, the Directive on Victims of Crime, and the Directive Against Sexual Abuse and Exploitation of Children. I mean, at legislative level, the European Union is probably the best equipped region in the world with regard to migrants or displaced minors. But despite these efforts, the legal framework of the Union is still imperfect and incomplete, especially when it comes to meeting the needs of unaccompanied children seeking asylum. This was clearly demonstrated through the managing of refugee flows since the outbreak of revolts and wars in North Africa and in the Middle East. According to my opinion, there are two main problems. The first one is that we ask too much from the European Union in this issue. According to the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, migration and asylum policies are a shared competence between the European Union and member states. However, so far, most of the current powers in these areas remain in the hands of member states, who have their own constituencies, their own national elections, their own priorities, their own agendas, their own internal problems. And the second problem is that the issue of unaccompanied children is at the crossroad between two legislative frameworks which are not always in harmony, namely the framework or the norms on the protection of children on the one side and the norms on migration on the other side. But before the dilemma between the sovereign right of a state to prohibit the unauthorized entry of aliens into its territory on the one hand, and the protection of children's rights on the other hand, I think there is no room for doubt. It is the protection of children's rights that applies. The identification of the best interest of the child should be the primary concern in any action relating directly or indirectly to children. So the best interest of the child override the legitimate interest of the state to control migration. It is as simple as that. It must be added that we also have problems concerning the international legal framework applicable in this issue. For example, we lack an adequate framework for the understanding and the protection of asylum-seeking children. The United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees provides a definition of the word refugee that was drafted during the Cold War in 1951, when political tensions were very polarized between the two superpowers. It was a time when the attention was focused on adult men. The problem being that refugee concept has remained, the concept of refugee has remained unchanged since the adoption of the Convention. The United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees has recognized that this definition of refugee does not capture well the spirit and the problems behind the applications for asylum that are presented by children, and therefore they are not well proceeded, these applications are not well proceeded and treated. Therefore, these applications are poorly evaluated or ignored, even ignored. For decades, children have remained invisible to the Convention and they have suffered the effects. We should adjust the definition of the concept of refugee to better match the children and to take their needs into account. The child should not be considered as a being who is always subordinate to the family. children do not necessarily have always to follow the legal condition of his parents or her parents. The child is an autonomous being, and according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, he or she should be able to apply for asylum independently. Indeed, the reasons why children may apply for asylum do not always coincide with those of adults. Most commonly, the reasons for children persecution are the following. They fear being involved in armed conflicts. They fear to be victims of traffic. There is also child labor, female genital mutilation, domestic violence, violation of their economic and social rights, for example, in the case of street children or children with AIDS, early marriage, sometimes they flee from a possible early marriage, victims of honor crimes, or even slavery. Nevertheless, experience shows that many unaccompanied children have their asylum procedure applications quickly rejected, because asylum, as I said, was originally meant and developed for political persecution, and children generally do not have the ability to prove that they are victims of political persecution. In addition, the widespread perception that the child must always return to his or her culture of origin is also an obstacle to children applying for asylum. The officers in charge of the asylum offices are not themselves well trained, and they ignore the circumstances that lead children to flee alone from their origins. Children arrive in Europe for different reasons, sometimes having nothing to do with persecution or fleeing war, but because of the desire to join their families, to look for a better life, or to flee from, or to look for protection. But whatever the reason is, they can find themselves in a very vulnerable situation because they're children, because they are asylum seekers or migrants, and because they enter the European Union, well, irregularly. Moreover, if they flee their country of origin because of persecution, hunger, trafficking, or conflict, they may face similar threats in Europe. To prevent this from happening, as I say, the European Union adopted an action plan in 2010, which ironically was not renewed. It expired in 2014. Unfortunately, the latest measures taken by the European Union regarding the migration from the Mediterranean are strengthening the surveillance of external borders, and they discourage migrants to travel. The European Union has concluded a shameful readmission agreement with Turkey in return for economic and political benefits, as you know. These measures fail to protect the person who flees. And if the consequences of this policy of border closure seriously affect migrants, the impact is even more severe for minors, because this policy denies their rights by preventing their arrival on European territory. Member states of the European Union prefer to draw their attention on the fight against smuggling and on a possible military operation in the Mediterranean in order to destroy boats, rather than thinking about the priority of saving lives. The strict control of border policy reflects the reluctance of Europe to protect unaccompanied migrant children through this migration control. It must be said that the return of a migrant child to another country or his or her forced repatriation to the first country of transit, if the family has not been identified and if the authorities do not know who will take care of the child, this is absolutely contrary to the best interest of the child. I have identified 70 problematic aspects concerning the whole course of accompanied children, accompanied or unaccompanied children from the moment of their arrival in European territory. And I have also proposed 70 solutions. I will browse, and I will not go through all of them, but I will browse them. For example, we must identify and register all children who enter the European Union. In some member states, the current registration procedure does not allow a proper identification process. We also need to create a database at a European scale listing the personal data of all children arriving in Europe, accompanied or non-accompanied. This would be a central file which should be accessible to all member states and European authorities. The nature of the data included in this register should not differ depending on the country of arrival, and the data should be visible to the authorities of all the member states and should be handled confidentially. There would be no risk of a double recording of the same child in two different countries. There is a German initiative by an NGO, a project that has just started in this sense, but with these characteristics, but it is neither official nor settled at a European scale. So I think that it should be really sponsored and dealt at a European level, at a European Union institutions level. European Union member states need to increase their personnel at the borders for registration. This requires a specific training regarding the identification procedure, including the procedure of finger trips. If states are not able to manage all the control and all the identifications, they should be helped by Frontex officers or personnel from the European Asylum Support Agency. The European Union should, with the permission of the concerned member states, deploy mobile groups of social workers, legal advisors, interpreters, and psychologists to serve the unaccompanied children and vulnerable children, even those traveling with their families. It is also essential to keep families together. We must establish a European family reunification program for children who arrive in Europe with family but who have separated afterwards. The European Union is also starting to work on this, but the database is not still ready at a large scale. The provisions on family reunification should be more human and child-friendly to allow the transfer of children to another member state in the context of resettlement programs when the child, aunts, uncles, or grandparents are located in another European country. Also, the directive on family reunification should be amended to broaden the concept of family and of members of the family. Unaccompanied children should not be allowed to travel alone. When traveling alone, they are exposed to serious dangers. Children living without family support may be at risk of exploitation and abuse by traffickers and smugglers. Seeking the families of unaccompanied children should be made mandatory if this suits his or her best interest. The European Union should create a centralized European program of family identification, a database coupled with a search engine to help identify the family of unaccompanied minors, unless this is contrary to the best interest of the child or unless identification puts the family at risk at their country of origin. We should reassure unaccompanied children who are asylum seekers and explain them that finding his family does not necessarily mean that he or she will be repatriated. In case of unaccompanied children, we have to be sure to check case by case that people who claim to be the family members of the child are indeed the family members and not traffickers. In its guidelines on international protection of children of 2009, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees found that today there is very little concern for children in asylum procedures. If they are accompanied by adults, it is assumed that children do not have different demands from those of adults, and they will therefore be treated as passive objects. And if these children are unaccompanied, it is assumed that it is in their best interest that their parents are found in the country of origin and that they are returned to them. This must change. Every child should have the right to apply for asylum, as I said before, independently. Children should be clearly informed so that they, in a way that they understand, that they have the opportunity to seek asylum. They are not normally told so. This should be done in a way which is appropriate for the unaccompanied minor. Also, they should have a voice which should be listened to, as well as to the their opinion. For example, in Belgium, Belgium distributes brochures and comics about the asylum procedure to children when they arrive in the country to make sure that they understand in a funny way the asylum procedure. I think that this practice should be, for example, encouraged. The European Union should also establish rehabilitation programs in the society of origin and integration programs in the host society which are specifically designed for children. In case the only solution to meet best the interest of the child is to let the child grow in his own social and cultural environment, then a respectful action plan should be created to guarantee a safe return. This program should be adapted to the gender of the child. In case it is finally decided that a given child is not entitled to asylum and that his or her return does not expose the child to dangers and where repatriation is recommended for the best interest of the child, I think that installing centers in the host country should be considered. These centers should be established for children who cannot return to their families. These centers should be run by the UNICEF or the High Commissioner for Refugees. We should also make a further effort regarding the societies of origin. This is a very generic and probably very naive recommendation, but the European Union should promote peace, development, and the end of poverty. The European Union should create partnerships with the countries of origin, should improve the education, should improve the training to provide for a better future for children in the societies of origin. The facilities and services that the children receive in Europe should be also adjusted to them, offering them medical services, education services, opportunities for learning languages, games, leisure, and support services that will certainly help children to overcome the psychological trauma. Access to the asylum procedure should be a priority in the case of children, and everything in this asylum procedure should be done with due regard to the best interests of the child. We cannot waste much time in the process of obtaining asylum, especially when we are talking about minors. The delay for obtaining asylum is often very long, and it has happened that sometimes the decision has been taken and communicated to the child when he was not anymore a child, and he was over 18. And this causes the loss of the right to be treated as a child and to be reunited with his or her family. The resolution on the granting of asylum should occur within a maximum period of 6 months, since the application was presented to the authorities in the case of children. But even if this procedure is to be shortened, the rights of the child should be guaranteed to the maximum level. Officers and authorities in contact with non-accompanied children should be specifically trained about the specific needs of children. They should inform children about the kind of situation that should lead to the granting of asylum to a child, even if these situations, as I said before, or these motivations would not grant asylum to adults. The support staff, that is psychologists, social workers, translators, educators, cultural mediators, etc., should be available immediately after arrival. In addition, professionals complain about not having received adequate and sufficient specialized training. They also complain that they are very limited staff to handle problems and situations dealing with children. We need not only a better trained staff, but also an increased staff. And all staff in contact with children should receive specific training on the various forms of exploitation and persecution that children face, so that they are able to recognize serious cases. They should also be informed about the legal ways and tools of protection that are available for complainants. All staff in contact with unaccompanied children and the children themselves should be informed about the mechanisms of prevention, identification, reporting, and investigation in cases of abuse or discrimination, acts of physical violence, psychological violence, neglect, sexual abuse, exploitation, or abuse of authority. children should be reassured that they will not be penalized or returned, or that their asylum application will be rejected if they report abuses, the abuses they have witnessed or the abuses to which they have been victims. The budget for child protection systems services, both at national and local levels in Europe, as well as the number of appropriate infrastructure and integration plans, should be increased. There are nowadays many differences between national policies regarding unaccompanied children within Europe, for example, in terms of access, age determination techniques, stay, residence rights, accommodation facilities, detention, repatriation. I think that all these gaps should be addressed because the level of protection should be similar no matter what European state we talk about. The standard protection and services that are offered should be homogenized for all European Union countries. It is not logical that children enjoy a different level of protection and that they receive different services depending on the European Union country where they are. And this also, I think, could go for adults. All children, asylum seekers or not, should enjoy the same rights and the same level of protection as the children who are nationals or citizens of that member states. The same standard of protection for any child. Now, the Dublin III regulation establishes that the state responsible for the asylum application of a child is the country where family members of the child reside, and this is okay. But in the absence of family, the state responsible is the one where the child filed the application. This Dublin regulation should be amended so that asylum applications are also alternatively processed or can be processed by the state where the child is located, and that it is done in compliance with the best interest of the child. The humanitarian clause of the Dublin II regulation allows for the transfer of cases between member states based on grounds of family reunification, dependency, or for cultural reasons. The application of this clause, I think, should become the rule in cases affecting children. And also the directive of 2003 concerning family reunifications leave too much freedom to member states to make decisions and does not truly protect all migrant children. Article 4 restricts the opportunity for a child aged over 12 to apply for family reunification in case he ends up being alone. I think this article should be revised. From the moment of his arrival, the child must be able to undergo a health exam while being accompanied by an interpreter. In addition, the results of this examination should have no impact on the asylum or on the status of the child. If necessary, psychological and post-traumatic support should be ensured. Most of the times, the psychological intervention is not assured for these children, at least in my country, and these children often have experienced horrendous experiences in the countries of origin. A legal guardian must be assigned to each child, but the assignment of this representative is not sufficient to ensure the child's best interest. Tutors or guardians should be trained. Their work should be supervised. They should be replaced in case they are unable to properly fulfill their function, and the views of the child concerning his guardian should be taken into account. There are still too many cases of children without a guardian, and cases where the guardian is not present during the asylum procedure. And there is also sometimes cases of lack of communication between the minor and his guardian, or sometimes the guardian is not objective and fails to defend the child's best interests. So, the functions and responsibilities of the legal guardian are not well defined at European level. I think these functions should be clearly set up and must be subordinated to the best interests of the child. The welfare of the child must be the primary concern and the main objective of the guardian. Because of his limited capacity, the child should always be informed about what role the guardian will play in his life or her life. Sometimes children do not know whether they have a guardian or not, and when they have it, they don't know what is his role. The guardian of the child should be present during all administrative procedures and all judicial proceedings that concern the child, and also during all interviews with the latter. These interviews should be adjusted to the age of the child. When authorities take the decision to expel a child, the child and his guardian should be present, and their testimony should be taken into account. The guardian should maintain a regular contact with the child and should be given the opportunity to give advice. A good initiative that has been reported is that apart from having a legal guardian, some countries assign a sponsor or a volunteer who is able to support the child, let's say, emotionally. Someone who spends time with the child and who can provide the child with useful information. Also, a social worker should be assigned to each child and to his family, in case he's accompanied, in order to evaluate the conditions of the family and those of the child. The duty to protect the separated non-asylum seeker child should be emphasized. We must declare also the absolute prohibition of placing child migrants in detention only for the reason that they are not in possession of the correct documents. We cannot take away the freedom of a child because he's an irregular. The High Commissioner for Refugees, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, has asked to apply in these cases an ethic of compassion. It should be measured if arresting children is in his best interest. There is a very unstable balance between the need to protect unaccompanied children by taking away their freedom and the obligation to ensure freedom of movement, especially in the case of minors aged between 14 and 17. So child retention should be considered as should not be considered as a potential option. The Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe has noted that this practice is harmful. He has suggested that a possible solution would be to control the movement of the children in a sufficiently strict way and to report to the police about the cases of disappearances. The measure of arresting children who have committed a crime should be revised and adapted to the best interest of the child, as we do exactly with children who have committed an offense but who are nationals of our country. Whenever possible, children should be placed in foster families who share the same cultural background of the child, and preferably from the same country, if possible. Placing children in detention centers with adults should absolutely be avoided. Foster families should be supported, should be prepared, and carefully monitored by social services. Their expertise should also be evaluated. Foster families are not always the best option when it concerns older children. The best interest of the child indicates that in these cases, it is best for older children, let's say over 14, it is best to house them in semi-independent apartments reserved to small groups and supervised by trained social workers. In France, for example, preventive teams are deployed, especially at night, to find homeless children and offer them protection. I think this is a model and that other members should follow. There should be a comprehensive needs assessment for all unaccompanied children, and children should be monitored regularly. The assessment should be carried out individually, depending on the case, on a case-by-case basis. There is also a very interesting project suggested by the Council of Europe, namely, it is called the Project of Life for unaccompanied children. This is a personalized plan negotiated between the child and the authorities of the host country, which aim to define the future prospects of the child and ensuring his best interest. Education helps overcome the effects of traumatic experiences. There should be adequate education and psychological support for traumatized children. Migrant and asylum children have as much right to education as national children. The directive on the conditions of reception allow in some cases for a delay in the access of education of immigrant children up to 1 year. I think this period should be shortened to a maximum of 2 months after the arrival of the child. And if necessary, the child should be able to follow preparatory courses and language lessons beforehand. The integration of children is more difficult when they are placed in special schools for migrant children or in schools which only host foreign children. I think that segregation should be avoided. Perhaps we should provide language courses also to teachers working with within the most affected schools. Maybe the number of teachers should be also increased given the current overcrowding of classrooms. In addition to language courses, study assistance and homework support may be necessary for the kids. Assistant teachers are therefore a good option. Often teenagers do not want to go to school. They usually wish to pursue vocational training in order to get a job soon and to be able to work within a short period of time. This is especially the case if they are not asylum seekers or when their asylum application has been rejected. I think that also loosening the conditions of access to the labor market would make it easier for older children their lives when they have the required age for. However, I think that an eye should be kept on children so as to make sure that they are not exploited and that, if possible, they can continue with their studies. Also, promoting contact between children from the same country is a good practice. It would be interesting to create social centers where meetings would be organized. It is necessary to involve in the process local and regional authorities because they administer many local services, many social services such as health, education, accommodation, food. And the European Refugee Fund should contribute to the financing of all psychological programs and all measures that states fail to implement. It is necessary to educate the general public, schools, health centers, police, etc., about the needs and problems of unaccompanied children in order to generate more empathy and support. Some states do not trust the age that is reported by the child, even if the child is in possession of the certified documents. The invasive medical examinations traumatize and intimidate children, and what is worse, they are unreliable. These examinations should be restricted to cases where there are serious doubts about the age, but I think that under normal conditions, the benefit of the doubt is the principle that best suits the interest of the child. The refusal to undergo a medical examination should not automatically result in the child's rejection of the asylum application. Children should be able to appeal regarding the age determination. The protection of the best interest of the child requires the ability to periodically review the decisions already taken on unaccompanied children and children traveling with family. For example, the decisions relating to accommodation, legal status, guardianship, etc. The identification of minors is essential because if they are not identified, they will be considered as adults and they will be treated as irregular migrants. The situation of non-asylum seeker children and that of children approaching the age of 18 present special difficulties and should be treated with compassion. We should ensure the best interests of children and offer them lasting solutions, and above all, we must ensure their welfare. Also, the European Court of Human Rights should be seized to decide on provisional measures whenever the repatriation or deportation of a child could undermine not only the safety of the child, but also his well-being, and therefore his or her best interests. There is a rule, which is the principle of safe third state, which allows states to refuse requests from applicants who have entered their territory through a country that meets the specific legal criteria to be considered as a safe country. However, I think that this principle should never be used against children. Given the necessity to ensure the best interest of the child, we should apply a temporary protection at a European level for all children who arrive alone in Europe. This status should be granted automatically if a child happened to be without his parents or without an adult of his family. In these cases, we should proceed without further investigation about the legitimacy of the arrival of the child. The proposed measure would simplify the procedures of determination of the child requiring international protection. The funny thing is that we have already a directive on massive temporary arrivals that already establishes this principle, but surprisingly, it is not applied. It is the directive on the provision of temporary protection in the event of mass influx. Also, the action plan on unaccompanied children 2010-2014 should be renewed because its application period has expired. A manual should be created at European level for officers, medical staff, legal personnel, judicial and social NGOs, and for volunteers who take care of unaccompanied children. This manual should explain all the rights that children have and the practices which are appropriate in cases concerning unaccompanied children. The manual this textbook should identify the best practices, but also the practices that are to be avoided, and it should also report the bans and prohibitions. The European legislation does not consider the case of children who are not entitled to asylum and who cannot be sent back home either. This remains as a national policy, and it is for the states to decide whether to grant them a residence permit or not. But in our opinion, this should be a European concern. And lastly, the telephone 116000 for missing children that has just recently been settled by a private initiative, I think it should be sponsored and followed by the European authorities instead of being just a private initiative. I know that the list of suggestions that I have proposed consists of very varied measures concerning anything that might occur from the moment a child tries to reach European territory. And I also would like to add that I am aware of the fact that the implementation of these proposals seems difficult today because of the economic and political consequences that they entail for the member states and for their governments. But I think that the states have no choice and must implement policies to make a difference at an international level. The issue of children must be a priority because member states have the duty to protect them. Unfortunately, given the persistence of conflicts in Africa and in the Middle East and economic disparities between these regions of the world, the number of accompanied children arriving in the European Union will certainly continue to increase in the near future. We must act effectively while respecting the rights and best interests of the children. Because beyond the status of a foreigner, it is the condition of child that counts. Moreover, for the first time since the beginning of the refugee crisis in Europe, there are more and more children and women than men arriving in Europe. In February, UNICEF said that adult men only represented now 40% of the migration flow at the moment. Only 1 year ago, 1 out of 10 migrants was a child. UNICEF now estimates that 1 out of 3 people reaching Europe is a child. And this figure reflects the reality only partially, because many young people lie about their age in order to continue their travel towards the north, and moreover, we do not know the number of children who have drowned, who have died crossing the sea to Europe. Although the exact number of unaccompanied children is unknown, in 2016, in this year, there are more than 60,000 unaccompanied teenagers in Germany and 36,000 children in Sweden. Undocumented children and unaccompanied children are more likely to be exposed to violation of human rights than others. One of the current problems is that these children are invisible and they do not benefit from the same protection that the rest of children of the country where they are. The increase of child migrants and asylum seekers has economic and social consequences for the whole society. This also has an impact on the integration of migrants and asylum seekers on the whole society. This requires a strengthening of the welfare services, health services, shelter, protection, since, as I said, host systems, identification procedures, and the offer of treatment varies from one state to the other. States do not always respect the best interest of the child enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child in these fields. But states have the obligation to pay more attention to the protection of children rather to the migration control. However, at this moment in Europe, this is not the case. For example, many children only receive medical assistance in case of an emergency, or they do not have access to social benefits, or they are discriminated and separated from the rest of students at school, as I said. The authorities should not look at unaccompanied children as if they were illegal migrants who should be expelled from the country. While most European leaders believe that the concept of a Europe without internal borders means that migration and asylum policies should be dealt with at a supranational level, in fact, these policies remain national in all aspects, as I said before. Some countries refuse entry in their territory to people from third countries who are not asylum seekers and who have no documents, including children. For example, Hungary. Some countries have included agreements with transit countries which enable them to return people back to their country of origin, even if when they have barely reached European territory, including children. In some cases, we are talking about hot and collective expulsions, which are banned in Protocol 4 to the European Convention on Human Rights. In those collective expulsions, the police does not check neither nationality, nor health state, nor the age of the individuals who are the object of the expulsion. For example, this is the case with Spain, which has an agreement with Morocco in this sense. Some European countries have also reached agreements with the countries of origin of the immigration, so as to return them not only with transit countries, like the case with Spain and Morocco, but also agreements with the country of origin of the immigration, so as to return nationals of this country as soon as the nationality is established. And this is done taking for granted that the country of origin is a safe country, which is not always the case. For example, Spain has an agreement with Senegal in this sense. Any Senegalese who arrives in our country is sent back without taking into account age or whether he says that he's being persecuted or whatever. Other countries make children undergo, without exception, very invasive tests to determine their age. Some countries do not register migrant children. Some countries do not assign them a guardian, like France. Some countries do not inform the children about the right they have to seek asylum. Some countries detain children as if they were criminals, like Greece. Some countries are too restrictive in the procedures of granting asylum. For example, Spain, which only gives 7% of cases from the total of petitions, it only grants annually 7% of asylum applications. In the absence of a robust European asylum system, member states will continue featuring their own practices. It is recommended to adopt a consistent and binding European framework on unaccompanied children, which should be followed by the harmonization of national practices. In addition, it is also recommended that a European-wide solution is created for all people, not just for children. I think that a real European asylum code must be created to replace all current directives and regulations. This code should include a generous European uniform asylum status, valid throughout the European Union. This code would be applied by an asylum authority, a European asylum authority, which should be given binding powers which would act in the name of the entire European Union. This common asylum code would be child-friendly and sensitive to the particular type of reasons that entitle children to the refugee status. This European code would be applied by a European authority in order to protect refugees. This authority would have the power to decide on the distribution of refugees between member states, accommodation and social rights of asylum seekers. This European authority should also have jurisdiction to compel national agencies that deal with migration and asylum to collaborate, because this is not the case today. In fact, there is a lack of cooperation between the different national agencies. In addition, today the Dublin regulations do not allow applying for asylum in the European country of the applicant's choice. Instead, it is to be done in the country of entry to European territory. A proposal, it is only a proposal that I do, would be that refugees submitted their preferences from any location to a European centralized body that is responsible for arbitration. And maybe as cases of complaints are increasing, a European Asylum Court could also be established within the structure of the Court of Justice of the European Union, just as the European Civil Service Tribunal was once created. I know that this idea of creating a European Court of Asylum, this is in contradiction with the current trend in the European Union, because maybe some of you are aware of the fact that precisely the European Civil Service Tribunal is being dismantled, and that in 2017 it won't exist anymore. But I think that it could be a solution in the case of asylum. In my opinion, all the territory of the member states must be considered as the territory of a single state for asylum purposes. In this line of argument, a central European authority would receive, would study, would decide on all asylum applications, and also would decide about the final destination of the individuals who were granted the status of refugees. Somehow, it would be as if the territory of the member states were provinces or regions of a single state, and a central authority decided to place asylum seekers here or there. We should also think of a substitution of the European Union member states by the European Union as contracting party to the Convention on the Status of Refugees. Or if this is not possible from a legal point of view, we could at least think of the European Union exercising its powers within this convention according to the principle of delegation. We could also think about establishing the legal possibility to file asylum claims extraterritorially at the embassies of member states in third countries. This is something that NGOs are claiming these days. This is a traditional demand of NGOs. But in those cases, if we allow to file applications for asylum in embassies, we should also provide the applicants with protection from the standpoint of security and of their material support. We could also think of granting humanitarian visas, or the opposite, waive the requirement of visas for certain nationalities. I think that the European Union has made a great effort concerning specific obligations to children alone. The Action Plan 2010-2014, the Directive on the Return of Irregular Migrants, as well as the Directive on Trafficking of Human Beings, I think they all confirm this. However, I still see so many examples of good practices as well as practices to be avoided. More and more children migrate to Europe while being alone. Sweden warned us recently that in 2015, only in Sweden, the number of children seeking asylum exceeded the total figure for 2014 for the whole European Union. In this current situation, it is therefore essential to establish a supranational policy with new guarantees. 1 out of 4 children seeking refugee in Europe in the last year was alone, and that is a lot, 1 out of 4. In 2015, 88,300 asylum applications by unaccompanied minors have been reported. For a long time, the European Union has been seen as a model for the protection of human rights and regional integration, but its current paralysis on the issue of the common asylum system may be a bitter failure in the history of European construction. And unfortunately, at the moment, the political climate and extremely high number of people involved may appear to raise the risk of diversion of attention and resources to the benefit of measures to discourage migration, to close borders, and to fight against trafficking. I would like to add a personal experience. Some months ago, I was invited to this Tunis conference organized by the European Commission on migrations, and some of the organizers of this crash course were also present. The event joined together people from the academia with also personnel from the European Asylum Support Agency, the Fundamental Rights Agency, the International Organization of Migrations. Apparently they wanted and they needed our ideas about what the European Union could do and should do concerning the so-called refugee crisis. And I think that the speakers at that conference, we tried to give the best of ourselves. We did deep brainstorming, we gave our ideas about how to overcome the crisis. And all the ideas that I heard during those days and at that conference were all in the line of reformulating the Dublin system, of creating a single asylum system, centralizing migration policy, offering humanitarian visas at large scale, loosening the legal reasons to award asylum, etc. This is the kind of proposals that I heard during those days. And I had the impression that they were listening to us, that the authorities, I had the impression that they were eager to have our ideas and to copy them. I had the feeling that they really wanted to reformulate the policies of asylum, refugee, and migration in order to humanize them. This is why I could not believe my eyes when a month later, this was February and March, I read about the agreement that the European Union and Turkey had just reached in order to return to Turkey any individual trying to reach European borders illegally in exchange for money for Turkey and some other shameful conditions. These could be hot expulsions at the border, and the fast or express resolution of the applications for asylum in only 2 weeks that has been put in place. I think that does not guarantee that at all that asylum applications are duly considered. Concerning children, this agreement violates their rights because it prevents children to reach European territory, and therefore it denies them the possibility to apply for asylum or to ask for the protection they deserve as children. But Europe should not allow the policies to affect children. Otherwise, it will be the values of Europe, in other words, our DNA, that will be involved and endangered. Children are not illegal. Children are only children, and they must be treated as such. The children who arrive in Europe should be treated just like we would like our children to be treated if they were alone and in a foreign country. So I thank you for your attention.